Chapter 41, Dungeon Fight 3, edited by Sebastian Yongho, quickly stood up from his seat. Catalina and Eligor's eyes widened and stopped breathing for a moment. They broke the wall and created a new path. It wasn't an impossible task, but it was something he didn't think about. Columbus egg. It's obvious after it happens, but it was an idea that was hard to think of. Wall break was a magic that many used during the dungeon battle. Because of that, many demons either strengthen the walls or set up the dungeon so that it doesn't put the enemy at an advantage after they've used it. But Yongho didn't have that kind of experience. The two previous owners shut themselves inside, so both Eligor and Catalina didn't have information about it. When Foras broke one wall, it made the other 10 rooms useless, and the traps that were installed between became useless as well. Foras started moving, and the room beyond the broken wall just happened to be the wall that didn't have any traps. Young Ho was able to assume Foras' next move. Catalina and Eligor also assumed, which is why they looked at Young Ho anxiously. Foras broke a second wall. Once again, the rooms and the traps became useless, and they were getting closer to the throne room. Like the time when the Crimson Ogre came, it was impossible for them to activate and deactivate the rooms to lead them in a different direction. The situation was different compared to when the new spirit of the dungeon was born. The dungeon was now stable because the spirit of the dungeon was in control, even though the rooms in the dungeon were easy to activate and deactivate, but they couldn't change a group of rooms at the same time. They purposely changed the layout of the dungeon to extend the passageway that led to the throne room, but that plan actually made things worse. They had to come up with a different plan. They had to make a secret plan. Foras destroyed another wall. The spirit of the dungeon yelled. The spirits there also saw the marked wall on the map falling apart. The goblins were filled with fear, which caused them to scream, and Skull stood up from their seat and grabbed the hammer. They didn't have time. Catalina clenched her fist. She wanted to call out to Young Ho but held back. She had to trust him. She didn't want to disturb him because she felt rushed. Even Skull waited for Young Ho's command instead of voicing their concern. A few seconds later, Young Ho spoke. "Let's move to the resource warehouse," he spoke quietly. Young Ho was sure that he spit out whatever came to his mind without realizing it. Young Ho looked at the dungeon map. All of Catalina's senses were on high alert as she looked at the map as well. The location of the warehouse. The room was located on the bottom of the intersection, on the right side. Based on the dungeon map, the warehouse was located on the lower part of the central passageway. Catalina remembered the time she fought against the giant with the green cape. Because of that, she understood what Young Ho was trying to do right now. It was only for a moment, but Catalina's face glowed. "Go to the warehouse," Young Ho yelled. The goblins quickly grabbed the weapons and ran. Trient and the salamander also hurried. The kobold, who was cowering in fear, also followed behind the spirits. Skull took the lead. The clay golem and the rock golem were just standing still, so Eligor commanded them to head to the warehouse. Beyond the second wall the forest broke, there was a trap. Foras thought they got Young Ho back through this magic, which excited them. Because of that, Foras made a mistake by walking into the room without any caution. Thanks to that, a few of the orcs were shot to death because of the arrow trap. But Foras still had a large group of spirits. Going head-on like this was the same thing as committing suicide. Young Ho waved his finger in the air while running towards the warehouse. The spirit of the dungeon answered right away. "Here are the number of enemies that are in the dungeon right now. Foras. 28 orcs, 4 imps." That was a lot. The fire trap was their strongest trap, and they only had 2 left. He originally purchased more completed traps, but they were useless because most of them were installed on the later part of the road. The moment Foras created the shortcut, half of the expensive traps that he purchased from the shop were neutralized, but they still had 2 fire traps left, and since those 2 were located in the center passageway, the shortcut was useless because they had to walk through the center passageway. Another variable popped into Young Ho's head. Even though a room was inactivated, it was still a room. Just because it was out of the dungeon's control, it wasn't impossible to walk through it. In that case, would they be able to forcefully create a passageway that connected to an inactivated with the wall break magic? And was it possible for them to move by walking through the inactivated room? The large space and the many inactivated rooms were the House of Mammon's strength. But not anymore. It was a double-edged sword that was placed on Young Ho's neck. He didn't even have the time to find the answers for the questions he had. A question without an answer was like a maze. It made his head spin. Because of that, Yong-ho erased the questions he had in his head. Instead of asking Eligor or the spirit of the dungeon, he ran. A small window of light was activated near his head, and it showed Foras movement on the map. Foras didn't use the wall break magic again. It was as if they realized that there wasn't a shortcut anymore and started walking on an outward path that connected to the center. It was a room with no traps. But Foras was cautious about walking into the room. Since the arrow trap from before caught him off guard, it was obvious that he would become more cautious. Foras became cautious about his surrounding again, and like before, they had to take their time when walking into one room. And during that time, Yong-ho and the spirits didn't stop. When Foras confirmed that there weren't any traps and moved forward with the spirits, Yong-ho reached the warehouse. The goblins were catching their breaths because they raced to the warehouse with their short legs. The Trent and the golems moved slowly, so they haven't arrived at the warehouse. Yet Yong-ho breathed heavily. He paid attention to Foras' movements through the dungeon map. Since he was at a disadvantage when it came to numbers, he had no choice but to use the layout of the dungeon to defeat Foras. Catalina and Skull read Yong-ho's mind. According to the dungeon map, between the warehouse and the Kirby Road, there was only one room that was inactive, meaning they could activate the room and create a detour so that they could attack them from behind. Not all dungeons were able to quickly activate like the House of Mammon's dungeon, and by quickly activating the rooms, there were definitely issues that Yong-ho didn't know about. But now wasn't the time to think about those things. The best time would be when Foras and their spirits rush into the remaining fire trap room that was located in the center. While they're occupied with the traps, that's when Yong-ho and the others will attack them. Foras cautiously inspect the next room. Out of the spirits that they had, if Foras had a skilled magician, then they would be able to completely get rid of the fire trap. Foras was a close-range attacker, and since their spirits were the same, Yong-ho was lucky. Some of Foras' spirits entered the fire trap room. Eligor, the golems, and Trent arrived at the warehouse. Yong-ho waved his finger. The spirit of the dungeon activated the room. Catalina and Eligor opened the door, and Yong-ho and the salamander ran. The remaining spirits followed behind Yong-ho. Right when an inactivated room activated, Foras quickly raised his head. He noticed a change in the mana. No, it was more like he instinctively felt danger. He quickly stopped the spirits and naturally looked behind him. Foras heard footsteps behind the closed door. They knew what that sound meant. Foras opened his mouth to yell. And in that moment, Catalina and Skull opened the door at the same time. Foras and Yong-ho saw each other. With just one look, they were able to recognize each other. Foras yelled. Yong-ho roared. Their cries were mixed together, which caused the meaning behind it to be crushed. The salamander released a flame by pouring all of their energy. Yong-ho was standing next to them, and while wielding Amon with both of his hands, he raised it into the air. He poured all the mana that he had and created a large wave of fire. A fire pillar and wave. And another was added. Activate the trap. The spirit of the dungeon yelled. Fire was released from the ceiling and the ground, and it enveloped Foras' spirits, who had advanced into the front room. The fire that Yong-ho and the salamander released filled the room that Foras was standing in. A predicament. There was fire everywhere. Catalina, Yong-ho yelled. Yong-ho didn't know what was happened beyond the fire that filled the room. All he could do was prepare for the worst. He tightened his grip on Amon. He poured out all of his energy, and even though it was only for a moment, he couldn't feel any energy in both of his arms. Catalina immediately understood what Yong-ho meant, and Yong-ho's hand was heading towards his belt. He ripped the seal on the last mana potion and poured the blue liquid into his mouth. He only needed a couple of seconds to do that. Since he used all of his mana at once, Amon's fire didn't last a long time. The same thing happened to the salamander's fire. But it was for a few seconds. It was short, but the timing was long. Foras and their spirits were harmed badly. The ambush was successful. Eligor and the golems reached the room that Yong-ho was in, even though they were a bit late. Yong-ho gulped the mana potion and felt his mana being recovered. The salamander started breathing heavily, since it used up its energy and stopped spitting out the fire. With a blank expression, Skull looked at the fire that filled the room. and Catalina hugged Yongho's waist. It looked as if she was going to throw him, but instead pushed him. It was unexpected, but it was a necessary action. Yongho saw it while being pushed. Within that short moment, he witnessed sight that made him doubt what he just saw. The fire split. A hole formed between Yongho's wave of fire and the salamander's fire pillar. Something was consuming the fire, and something large cut through the hole. He felt a coldness within the fire. The air was being frozen right before his eyes. The figure ripped through the curtain of fire and charged. Yongho saw a cold, blue mana. That blue thing cut through the fire, and after it passed through the fire barrier, he saw them soar into the air. It was the Demon of Power. It was another name the dungeon owner had. It was a distinct skill that demons received depending on their awakening. Foras, the Demon of Ice. Foras punched. They punched the area where Yongho's head was just in. Dungeon Fight 3 End. Chapter 42. Fierce Battle 1. Edited by Sebastian. The fist's movement made the air freeze. Even though there was some distance between them, Yongho felt the cold. Their eyes met. He couldn't see the hard muscle that they had through the years of training, the strong impression Foras had despite of their old age, and the white hair that formed. Due to the coldness, just their eyes, their blue-gray eye that was filled with bloodthirstiness caught his attention. It looked like Foras was going to release a roar soon. Skull. That sound broke the time that stood still. Instead, looking behind her, Catalina hugged Yongho and rolled a few times. Even though it was a little when they were further away, both of them bounced to their feet almost at the same time and wielded their weapons. Skull, who was stuck to the door, targeted Foras back and waved their hammer. It was fast and on point, but the attack was a failure because they yelled out their name. The hammer cut through the air. Despite of the pressing situation, Foras calmly moved his body, dodged Skull's hammer and counterattacked. The moment Yongho and Catalina stood up from the ground, their attack pierced through Skull's armor and hit their side. Their armor was damaged. Skull's body flew towards the wall as if they were hit by a car, and the fire that filled the room disappeared. There wasn't time to determine how many orcs were alive and out of them. How many are able to fight? Despite of being tired, the salamander attacked Foras' legs with their tail. It was a fast attack, but Foras lightly jumped and dodged their attack, as if they were able to predict the salamander's attack. Instead of attacking the salamander, the moment they landed, they kicked off the ground and charged towards Yongho and Catalina. Catalina quickly released an arrow. The arrow pierced into Foras' shoulder, but it wasn't enough to stop them from charging towards them. In a blink of an eye, the distance between Foras and Yongho closed, and Foras kept on throwing punches. They punched the air again. The cold air filled from the fist, filled the surrounding. Yongho managed to move to side and barely dodged their attack, but he didn't think about counterattacking. The moment Foras' fist missed him, Yongho's eyes met with Foras, and when he did, the flames of greed rose up. The fire that he randomly shot out enveloped Yongho. Foras saw the fire in front of him and instinctively backed away. After seeing the cold air in front of him, Yongho increased the distance instead of striking with Aemon. And during that opening is when he would attack. When it came to numbers, Foras had the advantage. But in the current room, Yongho had the advantage. The clay golem looked like they threw their body as they attacked Foras. Under Eligor's command, the rock golem and the goblins ran towards the entrance, and Catalina turned her body towards Yongho. Skull, who was hit against the wall and fell to the floor, raised their head up. Roaya. An orc charged through the door while roaring. It was Foras' orc guard, Buska Gokun. The other orcs were standing up as well. If all of them enter the room, then this battle will be over, Skull. Skull yelled out again. It was an attempt to catch Buska Gokun's attention, but it didn't work. However, the rock golem arrived just in time to charge against them. It was a confusing fight. They were in a situation where they had to focus only on the enemies that were in front of them. Yongho instinctively distanced himself more and tightened his grip on Amon. The blue mana flowed around the clay golem and enveloped them. The clay golem was charging on like a car, but they couldn't anymore. A white frost covered their body, and moments later, their body started crumbling. Yongho didn't think any longer. He gathered his mana. The sound of Gokun and the other orcs fighting around the small door didn't interrupt Yongho's concentration. He saw blue mana. As they punched into the clay golem with their cold fist, they cooled the liquid from the inside and caused them to collapse. Foras kept on letting out a horrible shriek and charged towards Yong-ho. Yong-ho slashed using Aemon. At the tip of the blade, the fire of greed was released towards Foras. Foras didn't try to dodge it. His power emitted cold air, and as it enveloped their two fists, they extended it out and tried to punch through the fire. Punching completely through was too much, but he was able to create a gap like when they first invaded. Foras opened the fire with both of his hands and jumped as if they were going to soar. Animal beast. He couldn't think of any other words to describe Foras. Foras looked down at Yong-ho with bloodthirsty eyes and roared, and Yong-ho looked back at Foras and roared back. The treant was waiting for the right moment, and when the cold and fire were mixed into the air, they extended their vine out. As soon as they wrapped it around Foras' body, their vines froze. Some even started falling apart. But it was enough to buy some time. Foras planned on directly attacking Yong-ho after passing through the fire, but they were held back, and Yong-ho and Catalina didn't miss their chance. Roar. The roar that was peculiar to the orc clan disturbed both of them. The orc, Busker Gokun, picked up the axe without any hesitation and was about to throw the axe at Yong-ho and Catalina Skullalo. Skull noticed and threw themselves at Gokun. The salamander gathered their remaining energy and spit out fire towards the orcs again. It was a mess. Yong-ho slashed with Aemon and Foras moved his body to the side of Yong-ho and dodged Aemon. Then they punched Yong-ho hard with their right arm. He couldn't dodge it or block it. Foras punched Yong-ho's side harder than he had imaged, and the coldness that was created by the blue mana was trying to deteriorate Yong-ho's flesh and blood. Catalina released an angry scream and charged towards Foras. Catalina's strength was her shocking agility that was based on her emotions. Catalina lowered her body as if she was crawling, and after going around his side, she targeted his back. But her attack was predictable. Even though Foras couldn't move as fast, her knew predicted on how she was going to attack. She was going to pierce into his neck with her dagger, so he moved to make sure the dagger pierced into his back instead. Once he felt the sharp dagger pierce into his back, he violently moved around. Instead of shaking off Catalina's light body, he extended his left arm out and grabbed a part of her body. He then spun her body and punched her. Foras' left fist punched Catalina's abdomen. It was so strong that it wouldn't be odd if his fist ripped through her thin body. Instead of screaming out in pain, Catalina spat out blood instead. She couldn't move her arms and legs, and from Foras' fist, the coldness started eating away Catalina's body. No! Eligor charged, however. Foras wasn't the type to stand there and get hit by a simple attack. He moved his legs and dodged in a way that looked like he was making fun of him, and because Eligor attacked the air, it ruined his stance, which allowed Foras to attack his side. There was a coldness this time too. Eligor let out a moan and fell, and then there was fire. The green fire enveloped Foras, Catalin, and Eligor. Foras quickly released the cold air. The fire didn't invade Foras, but it didn't matter to Yong-ho. The fire was released to cover the site, not to attack. Even though Yong-ho experienced one blow, he couldn't really move his body. There was a big difference in skills. It was different from the other insignificant demons that he fought before Yong-ho charged into the fire. He targeted Foras back and extended Aemon towards them. He attacked the air again, through the flames. Yong-ho saw Foras' eyes. After releasing the cold air, Foras turned around and twisted his body, which was enough to dodge Yong-ho's attack. The distance between them naturally closed, and Foras used their right fist to attack Yong-ho. In that explosive moment, the arrow that Catalina desperately shot pierced into Foras' leg. Like the first one, there was poison on it, and it caused Foras to stop moving. Yong-ho didn't see it. The moment Foras dodged Aemon, Yong-ho extended out his left hand towards Foras' neck. He couldn't reach it properly. It wasn't an attack to punch through or bash Foras. However, that was enough. Kaiwan's ring gushed out mana, the power of distortion was activated, and as it distorted the space, it created an intangible shield. It hit Foras' neck, and it wasn't an exaggeration to say that this was the starting point. The neck, one of the vital points that was difficult to train. The unexpected blow caused Foras to lose his stance. Yong-ho didn't let the chance pass by. He used Aemon and pierced into Foras' side. He then released fire through the tip of the blade. Foras resisted. The mana that was filled with coldness started approaching near Aemon. Yong-ho didn't pour in more mana. Foras' mouth was wide open as he let out a scream, and Yong-ho shoved his left hand inside of his mouth. He activated the power of distortion once more. He heard a disturbing sound. Yong-ho's left hand was pushed out, and red blood covered Yong-ho's face. Both Foras and Yong-ho collapsed to the floor. This wasn't the end. Despite of their jaw being destroyed and their mouth ripped, Foras didn't stop resisting. Yong-ho focused all of his senses on Aemon. He twisted Aemon into Foras and poured out all of his mana. The green flame started eating the coldness. Foras grabbed Yong-ho's neck, but they couldn't strangle or break his neck. Yong-ho looked straight into Foras' eyes. He commanded the spirit of the dungeon and focused the dungeon's remaining mana on Aemon. Instead of releasing a large flame, Aemon burned Foras' mana by using a small, cohesive force. Master Busker Gokun yelled. Despite of the fact that their pelvis was destroyed because of the huge axe, Skull didn't let Gokun go. Salamander spit out fire again, and Yon pierced Gokun's neck with a spear while he was focused on Foras and Skull. Another orc sword attack cut Yon's lower body. Blood was flowing out. War. It wasn't over. That's why Yong-ho placed his left hand on top of Foras' chest. The coldness climbed up his hand like a final curse, and he absorbed Hit-Greed's fire swallowed Foras' cold spirit. Spirit absorption. A change through that. It was more painful than pleasurable, and it filled Yong-ho's body and spirit. It was different from before. It was different from when he absorbed the spirit of someone that was weaker or on the same level as him. Owner Foras, the demon of coldness. Even though his power wasn't that strong, he was the owner of the dungeon that protected the house for over 70 years. He absorbed the spirit of someone stronger. Greed didn't throw away the coldness, and the power of evolution displayed the effective change. He swallowed Foras' mana. Mana was the base of a demon. Yong-ho lifted his head. A third horn appeared on his forehead, and he was able to feel a huge amount of mana flowing. The fight wasn't over, but it would soon be over. The Red Lotus Demon Lance. Aemon. A green fire was released from the tip. Fierce Battle 1 End. Chapter 43. Fierce Battle 2, edited by Sebastian Hay, was exhausted. His body was in pain. The new spirit that he absorbed restored his mana, but it wasn't enough. He was so thirsty that it felt like he drank the ocean. But he couldn't fall here. If he fell here, everything would come to an end. A fight where one puts their life on the line was an extremely exciting thing. It wasn't just about winning and losing. The decision of who lives and dies was decided in an instant. The fact that he survived made his blood boil. The sight and smell of red blood made his heart keep racing. But he had to remain calm. Even though his body was burning, his head and mentality had to remain cold. He absorbed Foras' spirit. He got stronger. It was a small amount, but he recovered some mana. During the short moment when he raised his body, a thought popped into his head. He released a green flame, which captured everyone's attention, and he counted through the flame. He took down the leader of the enemy. Foras was probably the strongest enemy within the dungeon, but he didn't exist anymore. Gokun, who was assumed to be Foras' guard, was also dying as blood was flowing out of their neck. There were less than 10 orcs left. When comparing to the number of enemies that invaded, this was a great accomplishment. But Yong-ho didn't flatter himself with it. When talking about victory, one had to consider not only the number of enemies, but the amount of damage it caused them. Catalina was lying on the ground and her body was shaking. She couldn't stand up, and the blood that she spat out was all over her mouth. Due to the pain she felt, tears continuously fell down her face. The clay golem was destroyed. The mud that kept the clay golems together was probably dried out due to the cold that Foras released. Skull couldn't stand up because their pelvis was destroyed. The rock golem was partially destroyed, and the salamander, who used up their energy since the beginning, was breathing heavily due to exhaustion. The kobold was whimpering in the corner, and as always, they weren't helpful. The goblin, Yon, died, and the remaining 3 goblins had used more than half of their energy during the fight. Yong-ho saw Eligor stumbling while standing up. Yong-ho looked around, and after taking everything in, he took a step. He straightened his back and fixed his posture. That small movement made his body scream in pain, but he endured it. He felt everyone looking at him. The orcs couldn't move. It was probably because they were shocked due to the death of Foras and Buska Gokun. The battle wasn't over, but it didn't continue either. Yong-ho turned around. He heard the sound of someone gulping. The treant's condition was fine, and instead of looking at Yong-ho, they looked at the orcs. It was an action that was worth complimenting. Yong-ho's back was turned towards the orcs, and as he approached Catalina, he lowered himself. "Catalina, ma, stay." Catalina couldn't speak properly. It looked like she was trying to force herself to smile, but she couldn't. The area that Foras hit turned blue due to their cold fist. It looked like breathing was even difficult for her. Yong-ho didn't say anything. Catalina played a big part in taking down Foras. If it wasn't for the arrow that she shot at the end, Yong-ho could have been the one on the floor, not Foras. Yong-ho slowly put his hand on top of Catalina's abdomen. It was really soft, but cold. The cold was like Foras' curse, and it felt like it was piercing into Yong-ho. Yong-ho accepted that coldness. As he absorbed the spirit, he also absorbed Foras' coldness, and it gave Yong-ho strength. He stabilized the coldness that was sitting on Catalina's abdomen area. Then, Yong-ho poured out his mana into Catalina through the palm of his hand. Even though Catalina was a mix between a dark elf and a succubus, she was still a demon. As a spirit that belonged to the dungeon, she soaked in Yong-ho's mana and was able to gain some energy. Catalina's expression looked relaxed. Her anxiety must have gone away, because she slowly closed her eyes and fainted. Yong-ho released a sigh of relief. If Yong-ho didn't get stronger by absorbing the spirit, then he could have been in danger. When the owner becomes stronger, so does the spirit that belongs to dungeon, and through this, he saved Catalina's life. He wanted to spend more time on Catalina, but he couldn't. Yong-ho stood up again. His eyes met with Eligor's, and after reading Yong-ho's thought, he nodded his head. It was a sign saying that he was fine. Yong-ho felt thankful and sorry towards him, causing Yong-ho to turn around. The orcs still weren't moving. There was an odd nervousness that filled the entire room. Everyone was still looking at Yong-ho. Yong-ho let them stare and started walking. When Yong-ho slowly approached them, the orcs started reacting differently. Some tightened their grip on their weapon, and others were looking at him while squinting their eyes. Yong-ho stopped in front of Yon and Jun. John and Ron were looking at the orcs while holding a spear, and June, who was the only girl within the Goblin Rangers, was crying while holding Yon, who was dying because their chest was cut open. Yong-ho activated the power of evolution and looked at Yon. It was a relief. Yon must have done something big before dying because their development rate was now at 100. Yong-ho placed his left hand on top of Yon's head. He poured a bit of mana that he had and evolved Yon into a hobgoblin, the power of evolution. Just like the other spirits, a bright light enveloped Yon's body. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that evolving meant changing their race. Their physique was changing, and it looked as if their body was going through a big reconstruction. Yon's injury was healed. Their uneven breathing sounded like it was going to be completely cut off, but Yon's breathing was stabilized. Jun looked like someone that witnessed a miracle, and looked at Yong-ho with an expression that was filled with joy and pleasure. John and Ron kept on looking back due to their anxiety, and they also couldn't hide their excitement. The orcs reacted as well. Some widened their eyes, and some dropped their weapons without knowing. It wasn't like a recovery magic. What happened before their eyes was more like a transcendental situation. Yong-ho stood up from his seat. Skull was quietly making noises, but Yong-ho stopped himself from turning around and instead looked at the orcs. He didn't have that much mana left, but he covered Aemon in fire one more time. There were 7 orcs that grabbed their weapon and stood up. Foras and Gokun were dead, but if all of them felt the same way, then it would be a problem. It was better if there was a leader among the group. And thankfully, out of the surviving orcs, there was one orc that silently stepped up to the leader position. It was easy to tell because the other orcs were glancing at them. The orc had a sword scar near their eye. It was old, but they were wearing a well-made armor and used an extremely large sword as their weapon. Yong-ho's eyes met theirs. He opened his mouth and waited for a moment. He spoke, hoping that his voice wouldn't crack or sound weak. "The fight is over." He didn't say it to look cool. He didn't have the energy to say anything else. The orc with the scar looked back at Foras and Gokun's corpse. Yong-ho didn't erase the possibility of them charging at him to avenge their owner's death. He didn't avert his eyes. He wanted to collapse to the ground, but he endured it with all his might. The orc closed their eyes. They carefully released a long sigh, and after opening their eyes again, they looked at Yong-ho. They placed the large sword on the ground. We lost. We surrender. As soon as the orc with the scar made their decision, the other orcs hesitated for a moment and laid down their weapons as well. One of them hesitated, and when the orc with the scar glared at them, they ended up throwing their weapon on the ground. The fight was really over, but he couldn't relax until the orcs had been tied up and locked up in the prison. Thankfully, Eligor stood next to Yong-ho. Maybe it's because his stamina was developed, but despite of the fact that he got hit by Foraz, he seemed fine. Eligor commanded the goblins and the treant to tie up the orcs. The orc with the scar looked at Yong-ho with slightly softened eyes, and Yong-ho nodded his head to tell them to relax. Skun! The small sound made Yong-ho avert his eyes. Skull, who couldn't stand because their pelvis was destroyed, was looking at Yong-ho. Maybe it's because of the atmosphere, but it felt like Skull was smiling. And then he heard a voice in his head. It was the spirit of the dungeon, who couldn't intercept due to the tense situation. You have won the dungeon battle between the owners. You were really amazing. It sounded like they relaxed a bit after being anxious the entire time, and it was cute. Yong-ho nodded his head. He released another long sigh. The first dungeon battle Yong-ho won. The dungeon fights within the demon world is between two owners, meaning it's a fight between the demons that own a dungeon, a fight to protect and take the dungeon. Dungeon fights are extremely dangerous. To the owner that's defending, losing meant that the dungeon was no longer theirs. Out of the owners that lost the fight, 9 out of 10 lost their lives, and even if they did survive, they end up wandering because they lost the dungeon and the spirits. The attacker couldn't easily acknowledge defeat. Either in a dungeon fight, the defender always had the upper hand. Because of that, it's natural for the attacker to use more resources than the defender. What would happen if all those resources failed them? They wouldn't lose their dungeon right away, but the dungeon's defense would drop dramatically. The law of the jungle applied in the demon world. Enemies would attack the moment their opponent becomes weaker. Because the situation turned out like this, the owners that owned dungeons in the empty southern region were gathered in one area, and because they were very strong, they didn't fight against each other. Since they might lose everything with one fight, it's obvious that they wouldn't. Dungeon fights happen among those that have power and often happen at the border. Those with many dungeons don't lose everything with one fight. Whether they win or lose, they save their energy for the next fight. Out of the dungeon shop's 5 board members, Samael was one with the fastest wings. They forcefully opened their sleepy eyes and looked at the demon map that was stuck on the official wall. Her office was extremely small. Unlike the harpies that enjoyed flying freely into the open sky, she didn't really like flying, even though she was a queen. She enjoyed using her beautiful black wings as a back cushion rather than for flying. Terrace too many. She wasn't talking about the dungeon fights among the 6 kings that happened often like some kind of monthly event. The southern empty region was weird. Normally, a dungeon fight happens in that area every few years, but there has been over 10 dungeon fights within that land. The demon, Embryo, has suddenly started increasing their power in the empty northern region. It was a rule for the dungeon shop to not take part in the fights between the demons, but that didn't mean they stood on the sidelines and watched them fight. If Embryo continued increasing their power, what would happen? For over a decade, the empty northern region remained peaceful through mutual control. But how will it change? The owners in the empty northern region were definitely weak. When comparing the land to the other 6 kings' land, it was a wasteland. But if someone unified the entire empty northern region, then it would be different. Samael closed her eyes and leaned her head back. Citri was in charge of the empty northern region. Did she know about this? And did she have a plan to control this situation? Or maybe there's something at the end of this situation. Samael stopped thinking. No matter what the case was, Citri maintained her position as a dungeon shop board member the longest. Samael was considered the newest member out of the 5, so they weren't in the position to worry about her. If she remained quiet, there was a reasonable explanation for that. Next. As soon as Samael spoke, the spirit of the dungeon delivered several reports. Before they became the 5 board members of the dungeon shop, they were owners that had their own dungeons. After receiving the report, Samael stood up from her seat. When she stepped out of the small office, a large void appeared. The ceiling was so high that they could put a tower in here. Samael continued walking. Instead of using her wings to fly, she used a magic that allowed her to jump into space, and she arrived at the most extravagant and fancy location that was within her territory. The dungeon store auction house. Items that are too expensive to price are often sold at this location. When took she another step, a white dress enveloped Samael's body. It was a simple white dress that didn't have any decorations on it, but that made Samael even more beautiful. Samael walked a few more steps. The incubus, Rod Carrot, was a follower of hers and also the general manager of the auction house. They approached her and gracefully showed their respect. The inside of the auction house looked like an opera house, and there was currently an item they were auctioning. The item they were currently auctioning was an eternal prosecutor. They were a talented prosecutor, and according to them, they were even referred to as the king in their world. Samael didn't visit the auction house because the prosecutor was that great of a figure. It's because of the figures that were currently at the auction house, the King of Pride and the King of Envy's representatives. On top of that, the King of Gluttony's representative was here as well. Therese, no way that the King of Pride didn't know about the fact that the King of Envy purchased 20,000. It was a secret that the King of Gluttony purchased a dragon, but the other two kings weren't dumb. They were always observing the King of Gluttony. The kings didn't come here themselves, but among their followers, those that were ranked within the top 5 came here to represent. This can be considered as a minor proxy war among the 6 kings. That was what Samael thought as she entered the auction house. Oribus was known to have the strongest superhuman strength within the dungeon shop, and said that the current balance will be maintained for a long time. But was that really true? Out of the 6 kings, no one was satisfied with the current situation. There wasn't one king that was satisfied with their current position. A small opportunity. The perfect opportunity that will make the wheel spin. If something like that appeared, if there was something that completely crushed a domino that stopped falling, the balance will be broken. Like in the past when Mammon, the king of greed, ruled, the sound of clapping filled the room. One of the representatives that were here probably called out a large amount that no one else could go against. Samael quickened her pace. The situation that occurred in the empty southern region was erased from her head. She put on an elegant smile that matched well with this place. Fierce Battle to End. Chapter 44. Unity Evolution 1, edited by Sebastian. Whether the Princess Ant voluntarily became independent of the Queen Ant or not, they'll end up getting a new task, building a new colony. The moment the Queen Ant died, the Princess Ant's conscience, which was like a frozen seed, started growing buds little by little. However, the time it took to grow the bud was too short. With a blank face, the Princess Ant started nibbling the pancake a little, and it was difficult to find traces of consciousness. Just like the Queen Ant, the Princess Ant looked similar to a human. The color of their hair was similar to gold, and they had mysterious green eyes that didn't have scleras. Maybe 12 years old. The Princess Ant looked like a girl of that age, and their antennas started flinching. The Princess Ant instinctively turned their head. Not only the kobold, but other spirits started approaching in a group. The Princess Ant waited while blinking her eyes. A nasty smell filled the nose. Blood, dirt, and other things were mixed into the smell. Just because they had a weak conscience, it didn't mean their basic instincts weren't working. The Princess Ant cowered like a beast filled with fear, and then the one that had a familiar smell appeared. It was the kobold wolf. The kobolds seemed excited about something because they started wagging their tail excitedly. Kobold quickly approached the prison cell and burst open the locked door. They walked up to the Princess Ant and grabbed her hand. Wolf. They were asking her to come out. But just like Eligor, all she heard was the kobold barking. On top of that, she couldn't make an assumption of what the kobold wanted based on their actions and expression. The Princess Ant looked at the kobold with a confused expression and turned her head. The foul smell arrived. Eligor, the one with red skin, arrived with green giants. Not only that, but he brought a large tree that Yong-ho has never seen before, and creatures with small frames that had green skin. Wolf. Kobold glanced at Eligor and forcefully pulled the Princess Ant's arm. In the end, the Princess Ant stood up and clumsily walked out of the prison cell. As soon as she walked out, Eligor placed the orcs into the prison cell. The orcs had an unsatisfied expression since their hands were tied, but since the orc with the scar on their eye walked in without a word, they didn't really rebel. After they followed them in, they sat on the ground. For the Princess Ant, it was quite a large prison cell, but for the orcs that had a larger frame, it looked small since 7 of them were in there. As always, the Princess Ant looked around with a blank expression. Eligor momentarily looked at her and spoke. "Take her to the dorm for now. Wolf, wolf." The kobold barked happily and pulled the Princess Ant's arm. The Princess Ant had no choice but to move to an unfamiliar place. Eligor watched the entire process and let out a deep sigh. Rickham, the orc with the scar on their eyes, was sitting in the innermost part of the cell, and Eligor spoke to them. "Please rest for a bit. I'll be right back." Rickham wasn't sure if he should believe what Eligor said, but Rickham nodded. Unless they were thinking about escaping, they wouldn't gain anything by creating conflict. "At least, give us some water." "Okay, well, bring you some water." Eligor exited the prison cell with John and Ron. After setting their roots in front of the prison entrance, the Treant watched the prison with a serious and stern expression. The fight came to an end. Eligor, the goblins, and all the other spirits were exhausted, but now wasn't the time to relax. Yong-ho passed out on the bed made out of straw. He knew everyone was exhausted, but he had no choice. He thought that letting Eligor take care of the rest and passing out on the bed was pretty irresponsible, but he couldn't resist. No, he couldn't think at all. That's how tired he was. He fell asleep as soon as he closed his eyes. He didn't have any thoughts. How much time has passed? Well, rise up again. You trust me, right? The voice belonged to a girl. They had ash-gray hair and narrow shoulders. Young-ho wasn't aware that he opened his eyes, but he saw it. His mind was blank, but he saw a clear image of them. Hez seen the beautiful girl with ash-gray hair before Kaiwan, the owner from 3 generations ago, the demon of distortion. In front of the beautiful girl, a boy with a weak face was standing there. The boy looked at Kaiwan with a longing look and then nodded their head. He didn't have to think long as to who that boy was. This was the first time that he saw him, but Young-ho knew. It was a small amount, but the blood of Mammon was flowing within that boy, the owner from 2 generations ago, the younger brother of Kaiwan. After Kaiwan went missing, they inherited the house of Mammon, and they lost most of the things that Kaiwan succeeded in obtaining. According to the record, they were naturally born with a weak body. That seemed to be true because underneath their muddy gold hair, they had a really pale face. Their longing expression looked like they didn't have any energy. It looked like they wouldn't even be able to run properly with their thin arms and legs. Kaiwan patted their younger brother's head. They hugged him as if they found him to be lovable. This was the first time he saw her soft and warm expression, since she barely displayed that side of herself. Kaiwan and their younger brother disappeared. Instead of an old, worn-out room, a small study appeared. Kaiwan was sitting in front of a desk. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She was a woman with a fierce look. She could be compared to a snake. She also looked like a leopard. The red leather clothes that she was wearing gave off that feeling even more. She was writing something with a tired look. It wasn't really a big room. It had a desk, a bookshelf, and on both sides of the room, instead of books, there were documents stacked on top of each other. It looked like Kaiwan's office. While wearing a pair of glasses, she was writing something with a feather pen, and the hand that was repeatedly on the abacus was now under the desk. She leaned into the back of the chair like some sort of laundry. Her left hand, a familiar ring, was on her ring finger. It was the ring that contained the power of distortion. It seemed like they placed a part of their power into the ring so that they can use it right away during combat. After taking a short break, she closed her eyes shut and took out a thick leather book that was placed inside of a drawer. It must have been another empty notebook because she started writing as soon as she placed it on the desk. Is it a journal or something? Sometimes she would draw inside it. Since Yong-ho was fixed diagonally behind Kaiwan's left side, he couldn't see in detail what she was writing, but Kaiwan's expression looked okay. She even displayed a small smile on her face from time to time. He heard someone knocking on the door. Kaiwan quickly placed the journal she was writing in into the drawer and stood up. She opened the door, and greeted the person that knocked. It was their younger brother. Kaiwan grew up into a woman, but their brother was still a boy. The two exited the office, and Yong-ho saw their backs as they walked further away from him. He heard their voices, but it sounded like an auditory hallucination. "Are you going to the arena again? It'll be quick. It'll bring even more awesome items, so look forward to it." The two became more distant. They passed through familiar hallways, and then darkness. The view in front of him changed again. It was the armory. The placement of the items were different from what Yong-ho saw, but he immediately knew. Kaiwan kissed her ring. She placed the ring in a small box and whispered something in a low voice. He couldn't hear it. The box was closed, and darkness filled his view. This was probably the last memory the ring had. Yong-ho opened his eyes. He rolled off the bed and landed on the floor. Ack! The bed wasn't that high, but since it was elevated, it was still painful. On top of that, since he fell while sleeping, it was an unexpected surprise, so it's obvious that it would hurt a lot more. "Office," Yong-ho mumbled without knowing. He unconsciously raised his left hand and looked at Kaiwan's ring, a shape of a wolf eating the moon. It was old, but it was still a beautiful silver ring. He suddenly felt Kaiwan's power, and he had a hunch as to how he was able to dream of Kaiwan's dream mana, the important element to a demon. Many thoughts and memories were left within the mana. He thought about Kaiwan's face. He still felt that she was a ferocious figure, but he felt a little more comfortable because of the warm smile he saw when she was with her younger brother. Kaiwan's office. If he found the office, and if he found Kaiwan's journal that was sitting inside the drawer, his thoughts ended there. The voice of a worried girl filled his mind. "Master, are you awake? How are you feeling? You're not hurt anywhere, are you? Can you hear me clearly?" It was the spirit of the dungeon. Yong-ho was able to come back to reality. His body felt heavy, and he lowered the arm that was raised. It felt like he was rooted into the ground, even though he was just lying there without doing much, but really didn't want to do anything. But he had to get up. How long has it been? 31 hours have passed. Yong-ho closed his eyes and let out a groan after hearing their answer. A day and a half passed. The fact that he woke up sooner than the time he recaptured the gold mine was somewhat of a comfort. Yong-ho raised his upper body while releasing another groan. His voice was really dry, and since he wouldn't be able to speak properly, he looked for water. After gulping down the water right out of the kettle, he continued with the next question. "And the orcs? What about the other spirits? Catalina and Eligor are safe, right?" The water helped him wake up, which caused him to ask one question after another. The spirit of the dungeon calmly replied. "The dungeon spirit, Catalina, and the other spirits are all safe. Skill and the rock golem are injured, so they're currently unable to move, but there isn't a problem with their life as spirits. They're currently waiting in the throne room. The orcs are quietly sitting in the prison cell, but we must hurry with cleaning things up." "Cleaning things up. We have to get rid of the corpse of the orcs that are in the passageway, and I also recommend changing the dungeon layout. Regarding the carriages that the attackers rode here, Eligor moved it to the dungeon entrance room for now. Since the spirits are currently in the process of recovering, no other tasks have been given other than this. They won, but the damage on this side was pretty big. As of right now, the only ones that are able to work were probably Eligor, Kobold, and the Goblin Rangers. And because your mana has gotten a lot stronger this time, I was able to grow a level as well." Dungeon step. If the rank itself increases, I'm able to take care of a lot more things within the dungeon. I'm able to maintain a lot more dungeon facilities as well. Please don't forget to visit the room where my main body is, the heart of the dungeon. He remembered briefly hearing Eligor talking about this. When Yong-ho's face started glowing, the spirit of the dungeon somehow knew and continued talking. "But everyone is exhausted, so you don't need to rush. Master, you should rest more too." He could feel that they were really worrying about him through their desperate voice. But he couldn't just rest. Like they had mentioned, they needed to clean up as soon as possible. But first, Yong-ho placed his hand on his forehead. The small horn that was placed in the center of his forehead felt out of place for some odd reason. It was the power he obtained after a tough fight. There was a need to properly test it out. Yong-ho instinctively took a deep breath. He activated the power of evolution. Unity, Evolution 1 End. Chapter 45. Unity Evolution 2. Edited by Sebastian Damon of Evolution. Name: Chwiryong Ho. Me race: half human, half demon. Class: Demon. Elements: Fire level 2. Darkness level 1. Coldness level 2. Individual characteristics: Calm, Crafty, Daring. Natural ability: Stamina, Manouth. 8 and 8s Felders, 48. Development rate: 44 2007. The stats window was a lot more detailed compared to before. He noticed the big change with one look. Individual characteristics and abilities. Yong-ho instinctively touched the horn that was on his forehead. Since Yong-ho became stronger after absorbing the spirit, the power of evolution got stronger as well, which allowed him to look at the categories he wasn't able to see before. He now had 3 horns. It was a major change that when seeing it from a spirit's point of view, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that they've ranked up. Nature sounds like it's referring to personality. Yong-ho frowned without knowing. He agreed that he had a calm and daring personality, but crafty. Even after placing his hand over his heart, he felt that it was unfair. A dungeon spirit's body and soul belonged to the owner and dungeon. Catalina was one of those spirits, and his attitude towards her was proof that he wasn't crafty. There were a few times where he had ulterior motives, but it was just a few times and they were insignificant. Body, and soul. Yong-ho cleared his throat when he thought about the spirit Catalina's face. No, her entire body popped up in his head. I acknowledge. Yong-ho managed to calm himself down after thinking about Eligor and Skull and looked at the abilities. It probably displayed the abilities that he had a natural talent for. It's probably different from characteristics traits, right? Since this has to do with individual talent. A succubus is known for their charm and mana, and a dark elf is known for their agility and vitality. It meant that their race affected the skills that they had. But a race and an individual was different. It wasn't odd for one to have an individual skill, stamina and mana. He somewhat understood that part. It's because his stamina and mana had more potential than the other stats. The change didn't just show additional categories. The level of the stats increased automatically, and the stat for coldness leveled up twice at once. It's probably because he absorbed the spirit that contained that power. I might be able to control both elements somehow. It was an embarrassing imagination for him to say out loud. So Yong-ho imagined himself controlling both ice and fire at the same time for a moment. Since the elements were opposites, he wasn't sure if they could create a synergy effect, but it didn't look all that bad. The problem is whether there's a method to using that coldness. For fire, he borrowed Ayaman's power and used it well, but this was different. He had to find a way to use his mana in addition to his power. And he had a vague idea of the solution. I have to learn magic. Mana was the root of a demon house. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that the time it took for them research a way to use magic with mana was as long as the demon world's history. Like always, Yong-ho quickly organized his thoughts. There was a need for him to learn magic, but it wasn't something he could do right now. Looking at the remaining stats through the power of evolution was more important, and since his development rate was at 100, he was able to evolve Mana level 433. 5. Unable to develop temporary. Charm level 02. Agility level 1, 2. Talent level 02. 5. Attribute enhancement level 0, 3, 7. Deadly sins. Greed. Yong-ho's eyes widened as soon as he saw the stats window. A comment that he's never seen before appeared next to mana. Unable to develop. A sentence that said that mana was unable to develop was right next to it. Yong-ho was going to develop his mana this time too, so he was shocked when he saw it. Why Yong-ho looked to see what changed compared to before. The potential development increased stamina, mana, and agility level increased by 1. The horn showed the class of the demon's mana. The development rate and a part of his skills changing was something he understood. Other than those differences, the only new thing that appeared was the attribute enhancement. Then what was the problem? Yong-ho looked back at himself. He remembered the time he first obtained the power of evolution. The power of evolution was Yong-ho's power. The root was from Yong-ho's soul and mana, and because of that, he understood it better than anyone else. At first, he only saw colorful smokes, but later, The method that it used to show it changed based on Yong-ho's will. This time, it was the same. It responded to his will. And Yong-ho was able to understand what the issue was. In simple terms, is it saying, I can't keep developing the same stat over and over again? Yong-ho's body requested for balance. It wasn't even requesting for a complete balance. Since he's been developing just the mana, his body wants him to develop the other stats. If Catalina's agility reaches to level 4, she might face the same issue. Yong-ho nodded his head. It wasn't completely stopping him, and since it was asking him to develop the other skills, he could handle it. Then the problem is, which one I should develop? Strength, stamina, and agility was something he immediately understood. Those three were the most involved stats during a fight. The others were charm, talent, and attribute enhancement. The main stats of a succubus was charm, and he had an idea as to what kind of skill that was. They changed to make themselves beautiful, and that would be done based on Yong-ho's preference. They make sure to leave a good impression. I'm sure it'll be beneficial if I develop it. It felt like it would help when appeasing the orcs that were in the prison cell. In the records of the Three Kingdoms game, Liu Bei would use their overwhelming charm to appoint a personnel. It's a bit difficult to explain talent, but I think I get the general idea. He had a feeling that the skill affected actions that required movements of the body or hand. Attribute enhancement did just that. This is hard. Yong-ho used the process of elimination. First, strength. The amount of strength he had now was enough. Charm. It was tempting, but maybe later. Increasing it to level 1 wouldn't affect a battle all that much. Since he couldn't use coldness, he decided to place attribute enhancement to the side as well. After eliminating a few of them, there was stamina, agility, and talent left. Yong-ho looked back at all the fights he fought. It was the most recent fight, and he remembered how much he struggled fighting against Foras ill. Increase my agility. Out of all the stats, the only one he would be able to see a difference was agility. If he became just a bit faster, then it'll help him in battles. He was tempted to increase talent as well, but since the idea was abstract, he didn't go for it. Yong-ho used the power of evolution on himself. Unlike the times he increased his mana, a refreshing feeling filled his entire body. He wasn't sure if it was all in his head or if his body actually lost weight, but it felt like his body became lighter. Phew! After taking in a deep breath, Yong-ho leaned his back against the bed. He closed his eyes and listed the things he had to do. The general list would consist of inside and outside. The inside work be taking in the orcs that surrendered as spirits, getting rid of Foras and the orc's corpse, reconstructing the dungeon layout, and making spirits like Skulland. Rock Golem undergo rehabilitation. The outside would be to sell the war carriages that Foras brought to the dungeon shop for money, and Foras Dungeon itself, Foras Dungeon. It wasn't that far from here. On top of that, Foras, his personal guard, and most of his troops lost their lives, meaning there was a high possibility that Foras Dungeon was an empty house right now. But he couldn't be careless. The reason why Yong-ho himself was able to win over 50 of Foras spirits was because of the dungeon traps. Even though Foras died, the traps that were installed in the dungeon were still active. If Foras was more worried about the other owners than Yong-ho, then there was a chance that Foras left some of his troops to defend the dungeon. On top of that, I'm sure they've caught on that Foras is dead by now. Since I've been out for more than a day, I'm sure they've prepared to defend the dungeon. If the owner dies, then the spirit of the dungeon that's connected to the owner dies as well. He had to be cautious. His side received some damage as well. And if they were to attack another dungeon just because they killed a owner, it may do more harm. First, he had to make the orcs his spirits. And since they know about Foras Dungeon, he'll collect enough information from them. It was okay to make a move afterwards. Other than that, the only other things I have to do is register the Princess Ant as a spirit and find Kaiwan's office. Those two tasks were important for the dungeon's development. Yong-ho looked at Kaiwan's ring that was on his left hand and he kissed it without knowing. He wasn't sure if he did that because it saved his life several times or because he remembered Kaiwan kissing it at the armory. Let's eat first. Since he slept a day and a half, that meant that he didn't eat for that long. Yong-ho stood up from his seat. Since he had a lot to do, he walked out of the room, Skull. When he walked out, he saw one of the things that he had to take care of. he saw Skull and Rock Golem, who were sitting next to his bedroom door. They both looked pretty bad. Since Skull's pelvis was broken, he couldn't stand up. Since they lost a leg, it's safe to say that they were disabled. The Rock Golem was sitting next to them, and their condition was bad as well. Their right arm was completely gone, and since there were cracks all over their body, it seemed like they were going to break apart soon. The Rock Golem didn't have a conscience, and yet there was a sense of sadness. But Skull, who was able to talk and roll around, seemed worse. Since Skull was special to Yong-ho, he approached the two spirits before going to fill his stomach. Skull, Skull. Skull spoke with the same blank expression. Maybe it's because he's always seen Skull roll around, but right now, Skull looked comfortable in their current condition. How is he going to restore them? The clay golem was completely ruined, so he couldn't do much. But for Skull and Rock Golem, since only a part of their body was destroyed, there was a higher chance of recovering them. He thought about either developing or evolving. Yon was on the verge of dying due to the injury on their chest, but thanks to the effects of them ranking up, it was healed. Wouldn't the same thing happen to both Skull and Rock Golem? To do that, their development rate needs to be filled up. Skull did a lot during their battle at the gold mine. And since Skull did well in defending against Forest Guard during the recent battle, it may be possible. Yong-ho activated the power of evolution. His eyes started glowing a green color as he looked at both Skull and Rock Golem. Name: Skull. Race: Skeleton. Class: Skeleton. Class: Skeleton Warrior. Attribute: Individual nature. Original. Capable. Talented. Development rate: 100. Bone strengthening level 1 to 2. Rank route opens upon development. Physique: level 1 to 2. Rank route opens upon development. Intellect: level 0-1. 5. Rank route opens upon development. Talent: level 1 to 2. 5. Rank route opens upon development. The description, original, put a smile on his face when he read it. Thankfully, Skull's development rate was at 100. The problem was that their rank route hasn't been opened yet. Will a simple evolution recover their broken pelvis? While contemplating, Yong-ho turned his head to look towards the Rock Golem from left to right and then from right to left. His eyes were following a line without him knowing. Between Skull and the Rock Golem, a line made up of a white light was connected. Yong-ho kept on looking back and forth and then read the new word of light that appeared above it. He unconsciously said it out loud. Union Evolution. Rock Skeleton Warrior. Yong-ho looked back at Skull. Skull spoke to Yong-ho. Skull, he somehow knew what Skull was saying. Yong-ho turned his attention back to the description. He gathered his mana Unity Evolution 2 end. Chapter 46. Unity Evolution 3. Edited by Sebastian. Union Evolution. An act to join two different figures into one. This was possible probably because the power of evolution itself became stronger after he got his third horn. Yong-ho understood the power of evolution this time too. The name, Rock Skeleton Warrior, was probably made when Skull and the Rock Golem were evolved by being unified into being. The power of evolution is growing based on how much Yong-ho was growing. But that didn't mean that it was an almighty power. There were limits and conditions that has to be met, just like how the development rate needs to be filled up in order to evolve. The Union Evolution was the same. It felt like there would be some sort of condition. He was curious as to whether it was possible to perform with spirits that were alive, and if two spirits have been unified, whose will remain, etc. But if he were to just focus on Skull and the Rock Golem, then it was simple. Skull was an undead. An already dead spirit has been binded to a skeletal body through the power of magic, and the Rock Golem didn't have a conscience. Even if the two have been unified, it won't affect Skull's conscience. A skeleton warrior that had the body and the strength of a Rock Golem. If this worked, Skull will be able to display a stronger power. If there's one thing that's getting to me, if he did proceed with the unification, then that'll be it for the Rock Golem. Through the recent battle, he lost the Clay Golem, and on top of that, he was close to losing the Rock Golem as well. But Skull was still important. It was a sad reality, but the House of Mammon was being operated by a small group. It was better to have one soldier that added to the group, rather than having two soldiers that were of no use because they were broken. Ready, Yong-ho spoke. Skull answered with the same trusting expression. Skull. Skull spit out their answer. Yong-ho placed both of his hands on top of Skull and the rock golem. He looked at the rock golem one last time and got rid of the regrets that was lingering within him. Unification, evolution, rock skeleton warrior. Yong-ho sent mana to both of them. He activated the power of evolution first. A light appeared. A white light enveloped both Skull and the rock golem. Next, the white turned to green, and Skull and the rock golem were linked into one. Based on the amount of mana that Yong-ho was pouring, the light became bigger and stronger, which covered Yong-ho's eyesight. A couple of seconds later, Yong-ho started breathing heavily. The feeling of Skull and the rock golem disappeared from both of his hands. Yong-ho clutched the air and took a step back after standing up and looked at the area where the green light was. The rock remains from the rock golem were all over the place, and a skeleton warrior was standing in the center of it. Their developed grey body was sturdier than the rock golem in the past, and weren't as excessive. They were big, but at the same time was nimble, and it gave off a much stronger feeling than a skeleton warrior. Yong-ho anxiously looked at the rock skeleton warrior's face. As soon as he gulped, green eyes lit up in the inner part of the empty skull. Yong-ho let out a relief when they released a loud and dignified roar. He smiled brightly, and they were both happy about the situation. Hold on, wait. Skull. Yong-ho activated the power of evolution and looked at Skull. He quickly read the new information. Name, Skull, race, rock skeleton, mixed spirit, class, skeleton warrior. Attribute, Earth level 1. Individual nature. Original naive. Individual stat T talent stamina. Development rate 0-100. An attribute that wasn't there before appeared. An individual nature and stat was added as well. The description, mixed spirit, caught Yong-ho's attention. A satisfied smile appeared on his face as he read the remaining information. Available race position advancement. Rock skeleton knight. Rock skeleton berserker. Rock skeleton archer. There were some stats that leveled up automatically, and the strength stat was a new one. But the portion that caught his attention was the new advancement route. There were 3. Just by looking at the names, he had an idea of what they specialized in. The skeleton knight was an infantry and strength and defense. The skeleton berserker was a high-ranked warrior that focused on offense, and the skeleton archer specialized in long-distance attacks. Since each specialized in different things, the silhouette of each route was a bit different. For the knight, the bone itself looked similar to an armor, and the berserker's arm became a bit longer and thicker. For the archer, there wasn't a big difference in the outer appearance. Just looking at Skull's change made Yong-ho feel satisfied. It was unfortunate for the rock golem, but with this kind of result, he could bear with it. Skull armed themselves with the weapon and armor that were on the ground. They wore the helmet, which was like their trademark, and waited for Yong-ho's command. And the spirit of the dungeon spoke right on time. Catalina and Eligor are heading your way. It seemed like they contacted those two right when Yong-ho woke up. The spirit of the dungeon did really well because Catalina, Eligor, and the goblins entered the throne room with food in their hands. Wow, master. Like always, tears filled up in Eligor's eyes as soon as he saw Yong-ho. Catalina reacted the same way as before. Her ears started flapping like wings, and the way her tail wagged made it seem like she would jump right into his arms if he opened them. But Yong-ho was cautious. Instead of opening his arms, he looked at Catalina's stomach. Since she was wearing her combat outfit, under the tight leather clothing, her bare skin was exposed. Her soft yet tight abdomen was in the same condition as before. Her light brown skin, which looked like sweet milk chocolate melted on it, was the same as well. He let out a sigh of relief without knowing. For coldness that penetrated her abdomen disappeared. Her wagging tail was proof that she was healthy. Sir, since he was staring at her for a while, she asked while blinking her eyes. He remembered that he was described as crafty, and after acknowledging it, he cleared his throat. He calmly responded to it, just like when he was in battle. I was worried, but it looks like you're all healed up. Do you feel uncomfortable anywhere? She replied as her ears shot up. I've healed up thanks to your mana, sir. Thank you very much for worrying about me. I should be one thanking you. I was able to live because of you. You're definitely the best guard. When she heard his compliment, her ears started flapping again and she laughed sheepishly. It looked kinda dumb, but it was pretty cute. Sir, I have completely recovered as well. I apologize for making you worry. Eligor spoke after taking off his shirt and showed the areas that forest hit him. Because his stamina had been developed, his body was sturdy. Despite of having an old man's face, Yong-ho turned his attention away from Eligor, who posed like a bodybuilder. He was always thankful towards Eligor. But this was a different situation. Yong-ho took a few steps back and looked at all the spirits, and then Catalina's eyes widened. Yong-ho was the only one that was in her sight, and the skull entered skull. Since their frame was larger than before and their color changed, Catalina blinked her eyes to make sure she wasn't seeing things. For Eligor, as soon as he turned around to see Skull, a bright smile appeared on his face, and the goblins expressed their excitement when they saw how big Skull became. Skull, along with their helmet, they lightly swung the warhammer, which was another trademark of theirs. Catalina and Skull became rivals at one point, but were teammates, not enemies. A bright smile appeared on Catalina's face, and Skull swung the warhammer again. During this time, Yong-ho activated the power of evolution once again. Rather than looking at Catalina and the other spirits, he wanted to see if a union evolution was possible. But information regarding the union evolution didn't appear for any one of them. It looked like it was possible for spirits that were already dead or didn't have a will, just like he had assumed earlier. Okay, let's talk over some food. I'll tell you how Skull became like this. Yong-ho spoke after deactivating the power of evolution, and the goblins quietly cheered. Eligor sat down after placing a mat on top of the carpet that was in the throne room and grabbed some food. They were usually smoked meat, bread, and other preserved food. Since the spirits haven't eaten yet, the atmosphere turned into a group get-together. Even though he ate with the House of Mammon's spirits every day, the explanation regarding the union evolution didn't take long. The base of the power of evolution came from Yong-ho's mana and spirit, but it was fully developed and it wasn't completely within Yong-ho's control. But it was a power that would completely be his someday. At first, he would see colorful smokes, and then the information window of the power of evolution changed to where it resembled like the ones in RPGs, and it was based off of Yong-ho's choice and will. A clear classification. The explanation was easy enough for Yong-ho to understand. After talking about the union evolution, Yong-ho listened to Eligor's various reports about the dungeon while eating. He said that the corpses that were in the passageway were currently being cleaned up. They stored 4-ass corpse just in case, and they placed the corpse of the orcs in an empty room near the entrance. They'll have to take it outside of the dungeon and bury them as soon as possible. The spirit of the dungeon briefly mentioned 4-ass war carriage, and they were placed in the room at the dungeon entrance. Since they were Western-style carriages, Eligor suggested that they keep 2 for the dungeon and sell the remaining. Of course, there was the option of keeping all of them for the future, but that was too far off into the future. In order to further develop, they required a good amount of money. The House of Mammon was quickly growing, and rather than keeping carriages that they may never use, it was better to sell them for money so that they can develop the dungeon right away. When it comes to financial issue, Eligor and Yong-ho thought the same way. So Yong-ho nodded his head and approved. Next were the prisoners. The orcs that were in the prison cell were quieter than they imagined, but just neglecting them was bad in many ways. Terry's definitely an issue with the capacity of the prison. They temporarily made the prison cell. Before, it was just the kobolds and the princess aunt that were in there, but the orcs were bigger, and on top of that, there were a lot of them. 1 or 2 days was fine, but there would be a problem with food and toilet if they stayed in there for a long time. Yong-ho placed the half-eaten bread down and asked Eligor, and the chance of them willing to join our side, very high. I think they're staying quiet because they had that in mind. Their leader, Rikum, is a very experienced warrior, and they even expressed their desire of wanting to join the House of Mammon as a spirit. Free spirits, especially warriors, are very similar to mercenary warriors. Since their owner, Foraz, died, it's only natural for them to act that way. Since their owner died, it's only natural for them to find a new one. It was kind of uncomfortable, but it was good news. The orcs have seen Yong-ho use the power of evolution. If they weren't going to join their side, then the only option left was to kill them. There's a possibility that it could be a false surrender, or they could betray us, right? Maybe to get revenge on us. If it is a false surrender, then there will be an issue when registering them as a dungeon spirit. That's something you don't have to worry about. The spirit of the dungeon must have been listening in because they replied right away. Young-ho nodded his head and spoke to Eligor again. Great. Then let's go meet the orcs as soon as we're done eating. Yes, sir. And here they come. After he finished talking, Eligor turned around. Young-ho followed, and when he turned around, he was the kobold, who was wagging their tail excitedly, and the princess ant. The kobold was holding the rope that was tied around the princess ant's wrists. It was a pretty shocking sight because it was like a dog was carrying around a leash, but the important thing was that that wasn't it. The princess ant was outside of the prison, Eligor explained. The prison cell was too small, so we didn't have a choice. They're not experienced in fighting, and they have a gentle personality, so I let the kobold watch them and move them to the spirit's dormitory. I apologize for doing this without your approval, sir. It was true that they exceeded their authority, but Young-ho didn't care. For the past 31 hours, Young-ho was in an unconscious state, and during that time, Eligor did what he was supposed to do. On top of that, Eligor was the butler of the House of Mammon. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that he saw the second highest ranking spirit in the dungeon. This can be seen as Eligor completing a simple task. After Young-ho told Eligor that it was okay, he motioned the kobold and the princess aunt to come closer. The kobold quietly glanced at Young-ho and then sat on top of the mat with the princess ant. The princess ant quietly ate the food that the kobold grabbed, and from the looks of it, they could probably register it as a dungeon spirit soon. But before that, they had to take care of the orcs. Young-ho stood up after he finished eating. He headed towards the prison cell with Catalina, Eligor, and Skull. His goal was to bring them to his side and obtain information about Foras Dungeon. There was still a lot to do today. Unity Evolution 3 End. Chapter 47. Unity Evolution 4, edited by Sebastian. The Treant and the Salamander were the ones guarding the prison. The two could go up against Skull when it came to spacing out, so it was their calling to play the role of the guard. As soon as Young-ho entered the prison, the Treant bowed and removed the root that was placed on the entrance so that he could enter. The Salamander was also crouched in front of the prison door, and when they noticed Young-ho, they greeted him by bowing. The orcs were sprawled out inside of the cell, and they reacted when Young-ho walked in. They didn't stand up and show their respect towards him, but the ones that were lying down sat up, and a few of them observed Young-ho sharply. After looking at each and every one, Young-ho looked at the orc that was sitting in the innermost part of the cell. It was the orc, Rickham, the one with injured eye that Eligor informed him about. Unlike the other orcs, Rickham didn't observe or glare at him. Rickham looked at him with a composed look and stood up, as if they knew what was going to happen to them from now on. They looked at Young-ho and gave him a small nod. Catalina stood next to Young-ho. Eligor and Skull both opened the cell door after Young-ho gave them the signal. "Come out, Rickham. Our master would like to speak with you." He had a serious tone. While the other orcs were quietly talking amongst themselves, Rickham walked out confidently. After Eligor closed the door, he turned towards Young-ho. "Let's go." The orcs started talking amongst themselves again, but when Rickham slightly raised his hand to tell them that it was okay, they became quiet. Like Eligor had stated, it seemed like Rickham had great leadership over the orcs that were in the cell. In that case, if Rickham joins our side, does that mean the issue with the prisoners will be resolved? As of right now, it didn't look too bad. If they didn't have a leader, they would all have different opinions, and it would be that much harder to take care of them. Young-ho didn't walk far and led Rickham to the room that was next to the prison. It was an empty room, but thanks to Eligor bringing a table and chairs, it didn't look that empty. Young-ho and Rickham sat across from each other while Catalina and Eligor stood behind Young-ho, and Skull stood behind. Rickham. Young-ho went straight to the point. "I heard that you're willing to become a spirit for the House of Mammon." "That's correct. Me and the other 6 orcs have the same thoughts." He didn't feel uncomfortable around Rickham. Young-ho was willing to take them in as spirits, and they were willing to become spirits. It was being easily resolved that he suddenly felt awkward for creating such a heavy atmosphere. However, Rickham didn't finish talking, and Young-ho wasn't sure if he should be worried or relieved. "But I would like to offer a small work condition. We're in the state of becoming spirits since we surrendered. And honestly, we're thankful that we're not being sold to the dungeon shop as slaves, but since we're being used for the House of Mammon's dungeon, I believe it's only right that we receive a base pay at the market value." "Base pay?" Dungeon spirits can be separated into slave spirits and free spirits. And since free spirits are being employed by the dungeon's owner, there are a lot of cases where they, for a fixed pay. Honestly, Catalina and Eligor are spirits that belong to house, and since they work as a guard and a butler, it's normal for them to be paid. The spirit of the dungeon spoke as if they were whispering to him. It was a reasonable explanation. It was weird that he didn't think of it before. The dungeon spirits weren't characters in a game. Since they made their living within the dungeon, just food and shelter alone couldn't satisfy them. In that case, not too long after he ascended the throne, Eligor gave him money saying that he saved them in case of an emergency. That saving probably came from his pay. The previous two owners have been paying, but I haven't. Of course, it's because the dungeon wasn't in the best condition. Yongho's conscience was oddly affected by this, so he turned his head and looked at Catalina. Because of their relationship as owner and spirit, they were able to communicate just with their eyes alone. With his eyes, Yongho asked if she wanted to receive pay too, and she somehow understood right away because she started twisting her body and displayed a puzzled look on her face. She kind of had a sad expression, but it seemed like she was. No, I am fine. But, after seeing her droopy ears and eyes slightly filled with expectations, it seemed like she did want it. Well, Catalina probably had things she wanted to buy as well. He felt bad that she was wearing the same clothes every day. Yongho sent a message saying, "Okay, he'll take care of you soon. You trust me, right?" And she slightly nodded her head as she tried to hold in her smile. 7 orcs, Catalina and Eligor, unexpected costs have suddenly been created. Of course, Yongho didn't provide just food and shelter for the spirits. Yongho wasn't the only one that benefited from the power of evolution. The spirits are able to transform their existence, and this was more beneficial than receiving pay. Even though the orcs saw Yongho use the power of evolution, they didn't know what it was and how it will benefit them. Even if he renegotiated later with the power of evolution, then he wouldn't have to spend as much. Anyways, this was something he could think about later. Yongho focused on Rickham again. "Is that your only condition? We're not in the position to ask for more, so we're satisfied with that." Rickham replied seriously again. He probably organized his thoughts while he was sitting in that cell. "Great, then let's start the registration process. Is that okay? I'm ready when you are." They say to strike while the iron is hot, so Yongho didn't want to waste any time. He stood up from his seat and approached Rickham, and Rickham quietly closed his eyes and lowered his head. With the death of their owner, the spirit contract from before has weakened. Some of the mana will be used when the contract is terminated. A new contract has been established. It'll begin. Yongho placed his hand in the air above Rickham's forehead. Like when the salamander was registered as a spirit, mana was released from the tip of his right hand, and a magical crest that wasn't there before appeared. It was Foras crest. When an owner dies, the contract between the owner and the spirit will weaken as time goes by and will eventually disappear, unless the spirit does something about it before. The spirit of the dungeon destroyed Foras' magical crest. They engraved Yongho's crest. The registration was complete. After opening his eyes, Yongho activated the power of evolution. Name, Rickham M. Race, Orca Class, Orc Warrior. Attribute, Earth Level 1. Individual nature. Cautious, simple-minded. Individual stature strength, stamina, and development rate. 0-100. Like the other spirits, it displayed detailed information. It meant that Rickham was successfully registered as a dungeon spirit. The power of evolution analyzed the figure and extracted information regarding the development information. That's why the skill can only be used on dungeon spirits that are completely under Yongho's control. Yongho felt a bit tired, so he went back to his seat. He went straight to the point again. "Now, I would like to talk about Foras Dungeon." "Yes, sir." Maybe it's because has been officially registered as the dungeon spirit, but Rickham spoke with respect. After collecting his breath, he started talking. "The previous owner. So, Foras still has a young successor. They probably already know about Foras' death, so they've probably ascended to the throne by now as the new owner. What kind of a person are they?" He was worried. If they decided to attack in order to get revenge, they can become an annoying enemy. Rickham must have noticed Yongho's thoughts because they answered in a slightly soft tone. Like I've mentioned, they're still young, even though they're Forast's child. They're inexperienced, and I believe it's too much for them to take the role as the owner. Because of that, the butler that's left in the dungeon is probably playing the role of the owner. Because of the current situation, and based on their personality, there's a high possibility that they may focus on defense for the time being. Now wasn't the time to worry about revenge, Yong-ho asked more. How were the remaining traps and spirits in the dungeon? Since Forest had to leave the young successor behind, Forest made sure the defense of the dungeon was in working condition. There are a lot of non-combatant workers, but there are over 50 dungeon spirits left, and the dungeon itself is prepared for the enemy's attack. So, it's not an empty dungeon. It was a bit unfortunate, but it was obvious. Having all the spirits participate in the fight was too much, and was also a reckless thing to do. The Foraz that Yong-ho went up against wasn't stupid. Rikum spoke. But, despite of that, it's safe to say that the dungeon's defense isn't half as good as the time Forest was alive. In many ways, Foraz was the most powerful being in the dungeon and Hez dead, and most of the fighting spirits are dead as well. It's probably not my place to say this after experiencing it, but with traps alone, there's a limit to how much they can defend against the enemy. Rikum stopped talking for a moment and placed their hand on the table. He moved his fingers little by little and pointed so that Yong-ho was able to see clearly. It seemed like they were explaining about the location of the owners that were nearby. The owners nearby will want the dungeon for themselves once they hear of Forast's death. Within a few days, there may be a dungeon fight within Forast's dungeon. This was a valid information too. Yong-ho organized his thoughts once again. Eligor, who was standing quietly, carefully spoke. If I may, sir, I think it's a good idea to leave the dungeon as it is. We'll be using Forast's dungeon as a shield against the owners that are located nearby. You're definitely wise, sir. A warm smile appeared on Eligor's face. When looking at it geographically, Forast's dungeon was located in front of the House of Mammon's dungeon, so they were like a castle gate. Like Eligor mentioned, using it as a shield would be great since it was located in front of them. Rikum stated this before, but as long as the defense was good, then Forast's dungeon wouldn't fall into the other owner's hands so easily. In that case, it would be best to keep an eye on it. If the other owners fought amongst themselves for it, then that'll be great, and even if one of them did win, they'll be weak due to the exhaustion from the battle, and it'll be beneficial for him to attack them. Yong-ho asked Rikum again. Do you know anything regarding the other owners, or the recent situation of this empty land? The only thing I know of is that a strong demon appeared in the northern region, and the other owners have been surrendering to them. If you're wanting to gather information, I think visiting the nearby pub is a good idea. Pub. It wasn't that he didn't know what the word meant. He was just surprised because the word didn't match the current situation. It's located either in a village or a meeting place that's in between dungeons. Along with Eligor, the spirit of the dungeon explained it to Yong-ho. Strong demons mark their dungeons as well as the lands around their dungeons as their territory. However, most demons within the empty land don't have their own territory set aside, so there are a lot of villages that doesn't belong to anyone. There are a lot that pass through, so you'll be able to gather a lot of information and hire wandering spirits as well. Their explanation excited Yong-ho. Got it? I'll think about it. Yong-ho stood up after finishing his talk with Rikum. He headed towards the prison again, so registering the other orcs. It wasn't that hard to register the remaining orcs as dungeon spirits. What came after was the problem. They were unlike the golems, so these 7 spirits needed their own living spaces, so there was a need to expand the facility to make room for them. The clay golem and the rock golem, who were used as guards and workers, were no longer here, so they were short when it came to mining, restructuring the dungeon layout. He could have used the orcs as workers, but since they were being used as soldiers, they needed professional workers. First, Yong-ho put Eligor in charge of the orcs and headed towards the throne room while holding a report that had specifications and numbers on the war carriages. With the money received from selling the carriages and the money that Forest had, he was planning on buying workers. But as soon as Yong-ho was about to sit on the throne, the spirit of the dungeon, who had been quiet all this time, mumbled in a slightly timid tone. Sir, I apologize for bothering you while you're busy, but aren't you forgetting something? They were different from normal because they seemed unsatisfied and was a bit immature. Why were they acting like this all of a sudden? Young Ho soon found out the reason: the spirit of the dungeon's growth. They told him not to forget, and requested that Young Ho visit the heart of the dungeon. Before you go to the dungeon shop and purchase new spirits, it's best for you to understand the dungeon's new functions and facilities. That's all. I'm not sad about it at all. You understand me, right? Young Ho chuckled at her girlish reaction. He turned around and headed towards the heart of the dungeon. Information about the dungeon's growth and new facilities. He was prepared for it when he woke up, but there was just too many things to do today. Unity, Evolution 4 End. Chapter 48. Dungeon Reorganization. 1. Edited by Sebastian. No matter what anyone said, the heart of the dungeon was the most important location within the dungeon. The heart of the dungeon provided mana to all the facilities within the dungeon, and the spirit of the dungeon, who was like the manager of the dungeon, lived there. If the heart of the dungeon dies, then the dungeon dies too. The dungeon wasn't a simple location or building. It was an enormous spirit. With Catalina following behind him, Young Ho entered the secret room that was in the heart of the dungeon. The bleak room wasn't any different from the last time he visited. "You're here, master. You didn't have to rush here." A moment ago, the spirit of the dungeon was urging for him to go, but now they were cunning. There was a reason why she had the voice of a little girl. Since it was such a cute whine, Young Ho just chuckled and approached the heart of the dungeon. The heart of the dungeon was placed on top of a rough altar, and they were releasing an even brighter light than the last time he visited. The spirit of the dungeon spoke. "Because you've gotten stronger, I was given the chance to grow as well. The mana that I need in order to grow has been charged, so all you have to do is give me your approval. Please place both of your hands on top of my body." Young Ho followed their instructions and placed both of his hands on top of the marble that was releasing an emerald-colored light. It was warm. It was similar to body heat. Young Ho instinctively replied to the question that popped in his head. He approved the spirit of the dungeon's growth. Moments later, it felt like his hands were being sucked into the heart of the dungeon. The light that was released from the heart of the dungeon grew bigger, that the emerald light filled the entire room. Seconds later, the light dimmed. A happy voice filled Young Ho's head. The spirit of the dungeon has grown. Their dungeon management skill has increased. They're able to install new dungeon facilities and manage them. It was something he expected, but the fact that they announced their growth was kind of funny. They must have read his mind because they spoke with a surprised tone. Everyone does it like this. This is the general format that the dungeon shop entered. Young Ho just smiled. Just like the spirits, they were connected to him as well, so he could feel the spirit of the dungeon being embarrassed. The heart of the dungeon did grow. The marble was as big as a person's head, but now they were 1.5 times larger, and the rough, rectangular-shaped altar changed into a trapezoid. But the biggest change was the room that the heart of the dungeon was in. From the dark, rough stone room, he could feel a small amount of warm mana. What kind of new facilities can be installed, and the new ones that we can activate? Instead of replying right away, the spirit of the dungeon waited for a bit. It seemed like they were sulking, but it was only for a moment. Then, they answered happily. The dungeon's daily mana production volume and the maximum mana storage volume has been increased, and the way the mana is distributed will be more efficient. And I think this can only be done once. But your room and the facilities within the dungeon can be relocated. Relocate? Are you saying I can change the actual layout? More than now. The dungeon wasn't a fixed building and more like a giant spirit. There was a time when they slightly lengthened the distance between the throne room and the entrance. But all they did during that time was slightly increase the distance. But it was different this time. The spirit of the dungeon was saying they could do more. Yes. Relocating the facilities does take up a lot of mana, but other ordinary dungeons are able to do this too. But for the House of Mammon, there's a small special detail that's included. As soon as they stopped talking, a window of light that filled one side of the wall appeared. It looked like they were going to show the dungeon map. When the window suddenly appeared, Catalina, who was looking around, started blinking her eyes. Young Ho felt a presence, so when he looked back, he asked the spirit of the dungeon, "Is Catalina able to listen to your explanation as well?" "It's possible." Their answer ringed inside Young Ho's head. But in a corner of the window, words appeared which looked like subtitles. The spirit of the dungeon started explaining. The House of Mammon's inactivated areas are like the ocean. The activated rooms are the islands on top of the ocean. An island was floating in the middle of a blue ocean. And when they slowed down, they started seeing other things around the island. A small deserted island and a large vessel with its anchor on that island. There were islands that were larger than the one in the middle. The inheritance that's been left by the previous owners in the inactivated rooms are the islands that are floating, or boats that's been drifting. Ammon, the gold mine that had Kaiwan's mark and other inheritance, were marked either on the floating islands or on the drifting boats. The dungeon facilities that the two previous owners left have been reverted by Eligor so that the dungeon could survive. But those inheritances are located somewhere within the dungeon. They slowed down again. The number of islands and ships that were on the ocean increased as well. The dungeon relocation is done based on the dungeon's entire area. But for the House of Mammon, the areas within my control are the only ones that are possible. And the controlled areas are the places that I've activated so far. That's correct. On top of that, out of the dungeon facilities, the location of the gold mine cannot be moved. Please keep that in mind. The video of the ocean that was displayed on the window disappeared, and the dungeon map that he was familiar with appeared. Yong-ho looked at the map for a moment and then nodded his head. He wanted to relocate the passageway that was connected to the entrance, so this was good. While doing this, he thought it would be best to move the heart of the dungeon and the throne room further back, and relocated the armory and the other facilities near the throne room. Having a detailed dungeon layout was the basics of the basics when it came to dungeon defense. What kind of new dungeon facilities can be added? The facilities that the previous owners developed or the layout that the dungeon shop designed already can be built. With my current skill, I'm able to build the dungeon prison, a dungeon waterway, a spirit dormitory, a basic dungeon workshop, and a basic dungeon training ground. Unlike the prison that we have, the one I can build is managed through mana. It not only drains out the stamina and mana of the prisoners, but it slowly decreases their will to resist. On the window of light, an illustration of the prison appeared. A magic circle was drawn on the ground, and the orcs that were imprisoned there looked real. If a waterway is installed, it will supply water. For the House of Mammon, there's an underground water source that the previous owners use, so we'll be able to get the water from there. When installing the waterway, it's best to think about the direction of the dungeon facilities. This time, he imagined Eligor drinking water from the waterway with a bright smile on his face. Eligor had to go outside of the dungeon every morning to get water. So imagining Eligor with that smile made Young-ho feel bad. It'll definitely be useful if we have a waterway. If possible, we might even be able to build a bathhouse, and we could even install a kitchen. Just imagining, it made it seem like the dungeon life became more luxurious. Young-ho asked, does the spirit dormitory have some sort of special function like the prison? Mana will be provided so that it can relieve the exhaustion that the spirits feel. Heating and cooling is possible as well. Catalina's ears and tail started dancing around at the sound of heating and cooling. The dungeon workshop is a place where items that are needed in the dungeon can be created. Since it's a basic workshop, it can support basic production facilities through the anvil and small furnace. It's not created automatically, employing a spirit with manufacturing skills. It was selfish of him to expect the items to be created by themselves. Young-ho thought about the dwarf spirit he saw before and nodded his head. Is the dungeon training ground a place to train the spirits? That's correct. It's a place to increase the effects of the combat training through mana. It won't be as much as the actual battle, but I believe it can increase the development rate. It requires a space that's larger than your room, so please keep that in mind. In the window of light, it displayed the goblins using the bamboo spears to attack the dummies that were set up. It was probably good for spirits like Eligor, since he wasn't a fighting spirit. Great. I'm starting to get an idea. Thanks. It's a good thing I listened. It makes me happy that you're happy. The facilities that I've explained to you can be further developed. Please keep that in mind as well. As soon as the spirit of the dungeon replied happily, the window of light disappeared. But then Young-ho spoke. I was wondering, can I give you a name? They didn't answer right away. A person would have already blinked several of times during this period, and he finally heard their voice. Are you talking about my name? Yeah, your name. The spirit of the dungeon didn't reply again, but Yong-ho could tell that they were happy, causing him to chuckle. He thought for a moment and then spoke. What about Lucia? It was the name of an NPC that appeared in a game that Yong-ho played often. The spirit of the dungeon replied right away. I like it. I like the image as well. Is that how you're imagining me as, sir? Since his thoughts were shared with them, they found the source of the name. It was a cute little girl with long, sky-blue hair. Okay, Lucia, I'll be going to the dungeon shop. Understood, I'll be waiting for you. Maybe it was all in his head, but the spirit of the dungeon, no, Lucia, answered in a more energetic and brighter tone than before. As the heart of the dungeon grew, the altar that it was placed in wasn't the only thing that changed. Yong-ho's throne also changed as well. The hard, square-shaped rock throne now had shapes. It's still pretty hard though. Yong-ho sat on the throne while happily complaining about it. The report that Eligor made was sitting on top of the dungeon shop's magic circle. I'll be back. Yong-ho spoke right before closing his eyes, and Catalina, who was standing in front of the throne, replied while her ears were slightly fluttering. Yes, sir. We'll be waiting. She said the same thing as Lucia. Is she being jealous of Lucia as well? Yong-ho purposely didn't point it out. After looking at her slightly pursed lips with a slightly annoyed expression, he closed his eyes. He connected to the dungeon shop's virtual space. In a room where both the sky and the ground was white, there was a large bed in the middle, and a beautiful woman with red hair was lying on the bed completely defenseless. Yong-ho was embarrassed. To be exact, he looked at the sleeping Citri with an embarrassed expression. What kind of welcoming method was this Citri was wearing? Her usual provocative dress. Because of that, it was embarrassing to look at her, and the shy Yong-ho from his high school days returned, causing him to clear his throat several of times within the awkward atmosphere. Thankfully, she was a light sleeper, so she sat up like someone that was brought back to their senses. She blinked her eyes with a blank expression, and when she saw Yong-ho, she was surprised and quickly stood up. The bed disappeared in an instant, and a luxurious-looking sofa appeared. With a snap of her finger, her hair was taken care of, and she gracefully sat on the sofa. But it was late. Yong-ho coughed with the same embarrassing expression, and because Citri felt embarrassed as well, her cheeks turned red. I tend to sleep a lot on a regular basis. Citri seemed different from all the other times, and it reminded him more of Catalina. But still, Citri was still Citri. She calmed herself, and created a sofa behind Yong-ho as well. She spoke with a graceful smile, as if the event that just occurred didn't happen. Seeing as how you're here, it means that you've succeeded in defending the dungeon. Congratulations on your victory. I believed that you would win and waited. It would be better to go along with it. Thank you. I'm also happy to be able to see you again, even though I'm not personally assigned to you. We've seen each other several of times. What did you want to purchase today? Are you here to exchange your prize or purchase material for? Oh my, you obtained a third horn. Citri spoke as his eyes widened. Yong-ho nodded with a composed look. Instead of touching the third horn that he still felt incompatible with, he placed his hand on top of the sofa armrest in a relaxed posture. First, I would like to sell the prize. Understood. Take a look at the item. Citri didn't waste any time. She lightly snapped her finger, and between Yong-ho and Citri, a large war carriage appeared. Chapter 49. Dungeon Reorganization 2. Edited by Sebastian. Since he had to take care of a lot of things as soon as he woke up, Yong-ho only saw the war carriage on the report that Eligor gave him. He did see it from afar when Forrest brought it with him during the attack, but the only thing he could make out was that the color was black and it was a square-shaped carriage. It's a KV-28. The KV series is one of the masterpieces. The fact that it's poorly designed is its flaw, but it's sturdy and powerful. The performance of the mana stored inside is pretty good as well. The war carriage that appeared between Yong-ho and Citri wasn't the one that Forrest rode in. A number was written on the report, and after the report on top of the magic circle, a model of the carriage was created. Yong-ho's eyes were filled with curiosity as well. The war carriage that was in front of him was like a tank. The body reminded him of a car because it was square-shaped and the color was black, but there were 6 small wheels attached to it. Each of the wheels were armored, and the window and door reminded him of a vehicle that escorted criminals. The war carriage can be pulled by various animals, but it can also be moved through mana. Of course, it'll be a bit slower. Citri spoke while pointing to various parts of the carriage, and it reminded him of a narrator model at a car show. When she opened the door, there were equipments installed, which made it easy to operate. It looks like one of those trucks that's used at a DMV. The handle, pedal, and the stick to change to gear was exactly like a car. The way to operate it may be similar to the cars that's in the human world. Like the outer appearance, the inside was bland as well. There was a square box in the middle, and there were chairs attached to the walls. Citri pointed to the box and explained. That's where the mana is stored, and it moves the carriage. You can say that it's the core of the war carriage. Citri stepped inside of the carriage, and after waving her slim finger, she opened the top of the box. And then, just like the heart of the dungeon, a rock that was as big as a fist emitted a bright light. It's not an exaggeration to say that the cost of a war carriage changes depending on how powerful of a mana was used. According to the report that Eligor wrote, it's equipped with KV-28 standard mana. Yong-ho nodded his head and looked at the armor that was attached to the carriage. If an extremely powerful mana was used, then he wouldn't have to use a horse or a beast, and instead could use it as an armored car. I'm sure I can cast some sort of defense skill, right? Yong-ho remembered the defense skill that the Queen Ant used and looked at the war carriage after taking a step back. Citri smiled lightly as she watched him. The KV-128 that Foras used is more for transportation use, but there are war carriages that are used for assault and breaking through traps. That's why they're called war carriages. After Citri stepped off the carriage, the sound of the door closing filled the room. Thanks to that, Yong-ho came back to his senses and focused on Citri. He wanted to ask her to show him a catalogue of the war carriages, but held back. He didn't forget the reason why he came here. I would like to sell 3 war carriages and 6 horses that pulled them. When thinking about just the size and the weight of the carriage, one would think that 6 horses are required to pull one carriage, but it only needed 2. It's probably because of the mana stored inside. Through the recent battle, Yong-ho obtained a total of 5 carriages. Out of the 5, he decided to keep 2 and get rid of the remaining 3. Citri replied right away. There are fine details when coming up with the cost of a used KB-128. The actual price will have to be determined by one of our staff after they look at the actual carriage, but since you're a valuable customer, I'll make sure to provide you with a good price. I think this is a good price for them. As soon as she finished talking, a small window of light appeared before Yong-ho. The minimum and maximum value were written, but it was 2 times more than what Eligor had calculated. You're satisfied, aren't you? Citri asked as she tilted her head, and Yong-ho answered with a slightly sly smile. The war carriage disappeared, and there was nothing else between Yong-ho and Citri. Citri sat gracefully on the sofa again and stared at Yong-ho. It was like she was asking him for the next transaction with her eyes. Yong-ho also sat on the sofa. Instead of playing hard to get, he proposed the next transaction. Since you've provided the minimum value, I would like to purchase spirits to use as workers and materials that are needed to maintain the dungeon, based on that minimum value. Citri didn't answer right away this time. She squinted her eyes, and after touching her chin with her hand, she smiled while starting at Yong-ho. This might be over-exaggerating, but it was the smile that a teacher had when looking at their proud student. Valuable customer, please excuse my rudeness. She fixed her posture after apologizing. She looked straight at Yong-ho. Honestly, I was worried that you were going to be reckless and say that you were going to attack Foras Dungeon, but it seems like it was a baseless rumor. It's important to work on the dungeon right now. And, as the one that has greed, it's funny for me to say this, but by going after Foras Dungeon now, we'll suffer a big loss in going after a small gain. Citri giggled at Yong-ho's comment. Even though it was kind of a thoughtless laugh, since it came out from Citri's mouth, it sounded extremely beautiful and elegant. It's what I expect from you. You're definitely worthy enough to receive my love. Like always, Citri expressed her kindness. Instead of falling into her eyes, Yong-ho gulped. Yong-ho predicted that Citri may be the House of Mammon's guardian. However, even if that was true, she watched as the House of Mammon fell apart. The 2 previous owners didn't get help from Citri. On top of that, could I buy some information? What kind of information? I would like to buy information of the owners that are near Foras Dungeon. And if there are additional information regarding the owner that appeared in the north, I would like to buy that as well. This time, Citri looked like she was contemplating. She squinted her eyes as she slightly bit her lower lip and then shook her head. You may think that I'm being nosy, but personally, I don't recommend you purchasing information. I briefly mentioned it last time as well, but the information in the dungeon shop is quite expensive. And, while we're talking about this, it would be best for you to know the methods of obtaining information outside of the dungeon shop. It was definitely an advice. Don't think too deeply about it. In the human world, when you become a regular at a shop, they usually give you benefits. He thought about this before, but Citri was such a charming figure that she was dangerous. No matter how he thought about it, trusting her recklessly would put him in a difficult situation. Thank you for the advice. I would like to purchase 3 clay golems as workers and the materials written on the list. Just like Citri, when Yong-ho finished talking, he waved his finger and created a window of light. It was a list of food, materials, and items that were needed at the dungeon. Since you're purchasing 3 clay golems at once, it'll provide you with a discount, which means you still have some money left. Will you purchase any additional items? Or will you make a payment on the loan that you received by putting the gold mine as collateral? This time, a window of light was created in front of Yong-ho. After seeing the marked amount, he had just enough money to purchase 1 rank 3 spirit. I don't like being in debt, but now was the time to focus on investing more. Since he purchased the clay golems, it was only a matter of time before the gold mine became normal. I want to purchase another spirit. If I were to give you a small discount, since you're a valuable customer, you may be able to purchase a rank 3 spirit. Should I give you the rank 3 catalog? Young-ho slightly shook his head at Citri's question. He had already made up his mind when he decided to purchase additional spirits. Is it possible to only see the spirits that have the skills to make items? If possible, I would like to give them the Master Craftsman role. Understood, I'll have that ready for you. Citri moved her finger in the air as if she was typing on a keyboard, and in front of Yong-ho, a catalog that looked like a restaurant menu appeared. Citri stood up from her seat. Like always, she spoke after gracefully showing her respect. Valuable customer, I hope you have fun shopping. I'll be going back to sleep. No, I'll take my leave. I'll see you next time. She cutely winked to cover her mistake and disappeared after turning into a light. Couple of seconds later, Yong-ho ended up chuckling after staring to the spot where Citri disappeared. He was doing his best to hold himself back, but Citri was so charming that he wanted to cross the line. Anyways, back to work. After slapping his cheeks lightly, Yong-ho looked at the catalog. At the same time, a large window of light appeared, and a list of spirits that had crafting skills appeared. The ranks displayed was from 1 to 3. Now, which one should I get? Picking an item was the funnest part. Yong-ho activated the power of evolution. Yong-ho returned 2 hours after he connected to the virtual space. His transaction with Citri was short, but choosing the best spirit took up most of his time. There was a large variety. After shaking his head, Yong-ho stood up from the throne and stretched. Catalina was dozing off while sitting on the floor and woke up when she heard him. You're back. I have been waiting for you. It felt like déjà vu. Of course, Citri was a lot calmer than Catalina and didn't drool either. Women do need their beauty sleep. Yong-ho thought optimistically about it and purposely touched his chin to embarrass Catalina. Catalina found out what that meant and quickly wiped off the drool that was on her chin. It was fun seeing her face turn red. Heh heh. While Yong-ho was laughing like an elementary kid, Catalina fixed herself and stood up straight. Even though it was a bit late and she could stop the cold female guard look, she spoke with that expression. Eligor said he would prepare the food. He said it will also be the orcs' welcoming party, like you ordered. The orcs are under Rickham's control and are currently resting in the spirit dormitory. Skull, Treant, and the salamander are with them. June has been leading the goblins and are collecting the corpses of the orcs. It was Eligor's decision. The reason why he made that decision was because an unexpected resistance can occur. Eligor always had a thoughtful reason when taking care of a task. The spirit of the dungeon, Lucia, continued talking. Eligor is preparing the food for the party. Kobold and the Princess Ant are watching. Since he took care of the important tasks, he wanted to register the Princess Ant as a spirit as soon as possible. I don't think she needs to be watched anymore. Should I round up Rikum and the other orcs? Catalina asked with caution. Yong-ho shook his head. No, there's still time until dinner. And I'm sure the living condition between the prison cell and the dorm is different. Let's not bother them and let them rest. Yes, sir. The location wasn't the only issue. Up until yesterday, they were considered prisoners, so they were probably feeling uncomfortable. Letting them loosen up a bit before eating was the better choice. Right, then let's go help Eligor. Yes, sir. For some reason, her reply this time was much more energetic than the previous one. Yong-ho left the throne room along with Catalina. Dungeon Reorganization 2 End. Chapter 50. Dungeon Reorganization 3, edited by Sebastien for Master and the House of Mammon. Cheers, cheers, the Spirits' Dormitory. Since all the spirits in the House of Mammon gathered, the large dormitory seemed small. The spirits either had beer or a cup of alcohol that was available in the dungeon world. Since the salamander didn't have hands, a bowl filled with beer was placed next to their head, and the treant poured the beer on the roots using their vine. Eligor brought out a large amount of goods. There was so much that if the goods that Yong-ho ordered didn't arrive tomorrow, then they would have to starve for the next couple of days. There were meat that they obtained from the hunt, and pancake was made with the milk, egg, and flour that was purchased from the dungeon shop, and a variety of vegetable stir-fry. The dishes weren't that amazing, but there was a large amount. The only downside was that compared to the food, there wasn't enough beer. It's because there wasn't a reason to drink it. But Eligor did purchase a case of it for Yong-ho just in case, and if it wasn't for that, everyone would be drinking water. The orcs were a more exciting race than Yong-ho had originally thought. No, there might be a difference in thought, but the orcs who were new to the House of Mammon clearly displayed their likes and dislikes. Foras was the one that attacked the House of Mammon first, and Foras and his spirits were trying to kill Yong-ho and his spirits. Rikum and the other orcs put their lives on the line to kill their opponent, and that thought didn't change. Dungeon fight. For owners that only had one dungeon, they had no choice but to be aggressive about it. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that they were putting everything on the line. In that fight, Foras lost and Yong-ho won. That was enough. There wasn't a need to add the words revenge or grudge to a fight that was already over. Even though he only drank one cup, the alcohol helped create the atmosphere. The orcs were able to realize that they survived. The goblins were dancing amongst themselves, and Kobold was barking while wagging their tail. The Princess Ant just sat there and watched everyone. He wasn't sure if it was because the food was good or because she enjoyed the atmosphere, but a small smile appeared on her face. At any rate, out of the spirits in the House of Mammon, the ones that died were the eagleless clay golem and rock golem. If there was a different spirit that died, then it would have been difficult for him to accept the orcs so easily. Yong-ho happily drank the beer. It's a given that he's never tried beer in the demon world, but he never tried foreign beers either. To him, alcohol was alcohol. The beer in the demon world must have been stronger, because he could feel himself getting a bit tipsy. That's surprising, sir. When Yong-ho spoke, Catalina, who was sitting next to him and eating a piece of meat, tilted her head. Instead of answering her, he thought about it in his head. I thought she wouldn't be able to drink, but she can hold her alcohol. Even though she drank a large cup, she was fine. He thought she would show her clumsy side again because of the alcohol. Yong-ho felt a bit disappointed and covered his face by raising his glass. Catalina tilted her head several times, but gave up and went back to eating her food. And another person was close to Yong-ho's Scully. Since they were a skeleton, they couldn't drink the beer. Instead of rolling on the ground, they poured the beer on Treyent's root. They must have drank twice as much as others because they moved their body happily. 2 hours later, when the party was over, Yong-ho let the Goblin Rangers and the orcs clean up and dragged the key figures of the dungeon to the throne room. Eligor the butler, Catalina, the guard, Skull, House of Mammons, Ace Rikum, the leader of the orcs that recently joined. Even though he didn't drink a lot, he really enjoyed atmosphere that his body felt relaxed. But before the day ended, there were topics he had to discuss. Even though he took care of many things throughout the day, there were still many things that he had to take care of as soon as possible. A delivery man from the dungeon shop will come by tomorrow morning. That's why I would like to talk about the dungeon's rearrangement before they come. Catalina heard the explanation with Yong-ho, and even though they asked Skull to come, they wouldn't be able to express their thoughts. Since Eligor and Rickham were key figures within the dungeon, they already knew what the rearrangement was. Through the recent dungeon defense, Yong-ho realized just how important the layout of the dungeon when it came to defending the dungeon itself was. The stage for the dungeon combat. The one defending the dungeon had to create a battlefield that was beneficial to them. The layout of the land played a big role during combat, and since he could rearrange it however he wanted, he couldn't express just how important it was. If he didn't think about the space and just placed one room after another, they could use wall break. But if they created a straight pathway, it would weaken the dungeon's defense. And if he focused just on the rooms and rearranged it that way, then it would be uncomfortable for everyone to live in. Yong-ho created a large window of light. After excluding the entrance room, he created a dungeon map that had nothing in it. Yong-ho and the spirits agreed that the throne room and the heart of the dungeon needed to be located more towards the back. The distance of the armory and the gold mine was greater than the distance between the throne room and the entrance room. By controlling the distance alone, it can increase the defense a lot. He decided to fill in most of it with the inactivated rooms that's been checked. It was nice to be able to use the empty spaces when needed, but there was a high chance that the enemy may use wall break on walls of the empty space. Out of the inactivated rooms that's within my control that I've checked, there aren't any rooms that contains the inheritance of the previous owners. The House of Mammon still had a lot of secrets. The area that was under the Spirit of Dungeon's control was maybe 20 to 30 of the entire first floor. For the rooms that were outside of that area, it was impossible for them to detect whether it was an inactive room, a dead end, or a room that contained the previous owner's inheritance. During the rearrangement, the gold mine became the reference point because it couldn't be moved. Yong-ho moved the throne room and the heart of the dungeon to the innermost part, which was close to the gold mine. The passageway from the throne room to the entrance room was somewhat windy. After obtaining the space to place the dormitory, the warehouse and other facilities rode around the throne became pretty simple. This should cover the basics. Are the new dungeon facilities next? Below are the list of facilities that's currently in the dungeon: gold mine, armory, dormitory, warehouse, prison, and torture chamber. By waving his finger, he listed the facilities that he could add more of on the window of light: a source of water supply and a waterway, dungeon prison, dungeon spirit dormitory, basic dungeon training ground, and basic dungeon workshop. He really wanted to add all of them at once, but he was limited on mana and material, so he had to choose. The facility that the spirits voted on, well, other than Skull since they only said their name, was the water supply and the waterway. The waterway was connected to the dungeon layout, so installing the waterway before the other facilities was the right thing to do. To raise a limit to where the water supply can be placed, it can become the center of the dungeon life, so I recommend placing it in the inner part of the dungeon. There were only 3 areas within their control where they could place the water source. Yong-ho picked the area that was closest to the throne room. After marking the water source on the dungeon map and connecting a waterway, an image of water flowing was added. Even though it wasn't actually installed and he was just seeing on the map, it made him feel proud for some reason. Yong-ho slightly glanced over at Eligor. It's because Eligor had to go outside of the dungeon to get the water, so Yong-ho was sure that with this installation, he would feel very pleased. But it was different from what he expected. Eligor couldn't stay still as he looked at the map. It seemed like he was internally conflicted. The prison, but the waterway. He was mumbling to himself, but since everyone was quiet, he heard him loud and clear. Yong-ho chuckled and placed the next facility that the spirits recommended: Dungeon Spirit Dormitory. The number of spirits were increasing, and in order to develop the dungeon, he was going to need a lot more spirits. Since he had to provide a separate living space based on their role and race, there wasn't enough space in the current dormitory. After adding the waterway and the dormitory, he barely had any mana and material left. Eligor started calculating to see if they could install a prison, and Catalina and Rickham recommended on saving it. And like always, Skull excitedly said their name. But Yong-ho didn't follow their suggestions. There was something he already had in mind: basic dungeon workshop. Catalina blinked after seeing a new facility being installed. Eligor and Rickham also had a surprised expression. Yong-ho enjoyed their expression and spoke. I purchased a spirit that had the ability to create things. They might not be able to create something amazing, but they'll be able to make items that we need in our daily lives. Catalina's mouth opened when Yong-ho spoke, and Rikum quietly nodded his head because 4S Dungeon already had those types of spirits. And like always, Eligor had tears in his eyes. Oh, a waterway, a workshop, and a master craftsman. It seems like the groundwork for the House of Mammon's dungeon is nearly complete. Catalina must have felt the same way as Eligor because she looked like she was touched. Rikum asked Yong-ho, "What kind of spirit did you purchase?" The price of a master craftsman varies depending on their skill. I heard that there are instances where free spirits ask for a lot more than what they deserve. Among the rank 3 spirits, I chose the dwarf. Like I mentioned before, we can't expect something great, but I'm sure they can make items we can use daily. And Yong-ho had the power of evolution. The skill of a master craftsman didn't have any relation to physical development, but if he focused on their talent and attribute stats, he was sure there would be results. In 4S Dungeon, there is one dwarf craftsman. Even though they were crude, they were talented. There is a bit of a difference between the dwarves, but I think you made a great choice. After adding in the dungeon workshop, the dungeon map looked a lot better. I'm pretty proud of it. When he first came, the only facility the dungeon had was the throne room, making it a very bleak dungeon. Eligor managed to return to his normal self and asked Yong-ho as he turned around. A massive amount of mana and time is required when rearranging the dungeon. After the dungeon shop's delivery man arrives tomorrow, he'll make sure to make preparations for the rearrangement. It was a task to completely change the dungeon, and even though it was a small housekeeping task, there was a need to do it. But Yong-ho shook his head. No, there's something else that needs to be done before that, before rearranging the dungeon, before the passageway that Yong-ho saw changes. Catalina and Eligor both looked at Yong-ho with a confused expression. Rikum wondered if it was regarding the pub that he mentioned before. Skull was rolling on the ground as always, and was saying their name. It was more fitting because their body was now made out of stone. Yong-ho looked at the silver ring that was on his left hand, a wolf that was swallowing a moon, a woman with silver hair saying that they'll rise up again no matter what. The owner from 3 generations ago, well, find Kaiwan's office. Kaiwan's journal might be there. Her records. Yong-ho closed his eyes. He recalled Kaiwan's face. Dungeon reorganization. 3 end.